My father, I will not fail them. The thunderous crack of the ice echoed like thunder, swallowing the wind's cry. Borislav felt the arrow's tip freeze in his numb fingers as the largest buffalo in the herd, a 5-ton monster, turned its furious red eyes directly upon him. The ground beneath his feet groaned, a crack opening towards the icy abyss, and what he did next would decide the fate of the entire village. Borislav's heart pounded like a war drum in his frozen chest. The giant buffalo's warm breath, heavy and dense, fogged the air before him, and the strong scent of the wild animal filled his nostrils. In those few seconds that stretched like an eternity, the promise made to his father echoed in his mind, clearer than the wind's howl, never to allow Kair to succumb to hunger. He saw the pale face of his little sister, Anya, the faint glimmer in her hungry eyes. There was no room for hesitation, no time for the fear that tried to paralyze him. With a strength that seemed to come from every ancestor, from every hunter who had once defied Yakutia, Borislav released the arrow. It was not a hasty shot, but an act of faith and precision, guided by years of training and the wisdom that ran in his veins. The arrow whistled, a thin line of hope against the furious white of the blizzard, and found its target with brutal accuracy. The buffalo, a 5,000-kilogram colossus, let out a roar that made the ice itself tremble, a sound of pain and fury that mingled with the wind. Its red eyes, once full of menace, now widened in shock before dimming. The giant staggered, its massive legs giving way under its enormous weight, and collapsed onto the frozen surface with a thud that reverberated like distant thunder. The impact was devastating. A new and terrifying network of cracks spread across the lake, like dark blue veins running across the ice's white skin. Borislav felt the ground beneath his feet sink slightly, a sinister warning. The icy abyss seemed to breathe, ready to swallow everything. The other 6 buffaloes in the herd, startled by the sound and the sudden fall of their leader, began to move away, their heavy hooves raising clouds of snow. The immediate danger of being trampled had passed, but a new and more insidious risk emerged. The ice, now weakened, and the almost impossible task of moving that mountain of meat. Borislav could not lose a second. If the animal sank, all his sacrifice would have been in vain. The village, his sister, would be lost. With numb fingers that barely felt the thick rope, he hurried towards the prey. Every movement was a struggle against the paralyzing cold and the fear that the ice would give way at any moment. He needed to secure the buffalo, drag it to a safer area, away from the main crack. His muscles screamed in protest with every pull, every effort to wrap the rope around one of the animal's enormous legs. Cold sweat ran down his forehead, mixing with the snowflakes that lashed his face. The task seemed superhuman. The buffalo was a fortress of flesh and bone, unmovable. Borislav pulled, gritted his teeth, and his feet slipped on the treacherous ice. He imagined the wrinkled hands of the village elders, the hopeful faces of the children. The image of Anya, with her cracked lips and sunken eyes, was a fire that burned in his chest, warming him against the relentless cold. He was not just dragging an animal, he was dragging hope, life, the future of Kair. Every inch gained was a victory against hopelessness, a silent cry of, "I will not fail." The blizzard intensified, turning the world into a white blur. But Borislav, with the giant buffalo and the treacherous ice, continued his solitary struggle. Borislav dug his feet into the slick ice, his body leaning at an almost impossible angle, every muscle tensed in desperate effort. The rope, rough and frozen, cut into his hands even through his hide gloves. The buffalo, a dark, inert mountain, seemed to mock his strength, refusing to yield even a millimeter. The wind howled, bringing with it ice crystals that stung his exposed skin, and the blizzard blinded him, turning the horizon into an impenetrable veil. He pulled again with a guttural cry that was lost in the storm's roar, and felt a sharp crack in his back. The pain was a cruel reminder of his limits, but the image of Anya, thin and fragile, overshadowed any physical agony. He could not fail. He could not. His father's wisdom echoed in his mind, not about brute strength, but about nature's intelligence. Ice is an ally and an enemy, my son. Know its weaknesses, but also its virtues. Borislav remembered how the ancient hunters used the terrain to their advantage. He couldn't move the entire buffalo at once, but perhaps he could unbalance it, use the animal's weight against itself. With a plan forming amidst the urgency, he began to work, not pulling, but trying to roll the gigantic body, seeking any slight incline, any irregularity in the ice that might offer an advantage. It was slow, agonizing work, inch by inch, while the ice beneath his feet continued to groan, a constant omen of disaster. Meanwhile, in the village of Kaya, the flickering light of the campfire barely warmed the small hide cabin. Anya, lying on a bed of furs, coughed weakly, her large dark eyes fixed on the ceiling. Her mother, Elena, a woman whose face was marked by time and worry, stroked her thin hair. Every cough from Anya was a stab in Elena's heart, a reminder of the hunger that gripped them all. "He will return, my little one," Elena whispered, more to herself than to her daughter, as her eyes drifted to the cabin's entrance, where the storm seemed intent on invading. Elder Yakov, sitting by the fire, watched the family with a heavy gaze. The village's hope rested on Borislav's shoulders, a burden that seemed too heavy for a young man. "The winter is cruel this year," Yakov said, his voice hoarse, breaking the heavy silence. "I've never seen game so scarce, nor the cold so biting." Elena squeezed Anya's hand. "Borislav is strong. He has his father's heart." But uncertainty hung in the air like the campfire smoke. No one dared to say aloud what everyone feared, that Borislav might not return, that the ice might swallow him, or that the storm's fury would be stronger than his will. With each gust of wind that shook the cabin, a shiver ran down everyone's spine, a silent fear settling in their hearts. Back on the lake, Borislav finally managed to turn the buffalo a fraction. It was tiny, almost imperceptible progress, but it was progress. The sweat on his forehead froze instantly, forming small beads of ice. His lungs burned, and his muscles trembled uncontrollably. With each movement, he felt the fragility of the ice beneath him, a dangerous dance between life and death. But the sight of Anya, the promise to his father, pushed him forward. He was not just fighting the cold and the animal's weight, he was fighting despair against the idea that Kaya might succumb. With a new breath, he prepared for the next push, the next inch, knowing that every fiber of his being would be tested to the limit, but hope, however faint, still burned strong and resilient in his chest. Borislav, his face contorted and body trembling, pushed again. The rope, now damp and slippery from frozen sweat, felt like an extension of his tendons. He felt his right shoulder protest with a searing pain, a warning of limits exceeded. But the idea of stopping was unthinkable. Every fiber of his being screamed to continue, driven by the vision of Anya, her pleading eyes. He was not just moving a buffalo. He was moving the future of his village, the warmth of the fires, the laughter of the children, the life of Kaya. The ice beneath him groaned once more, a deep, menacing sound that made his heart race. A new crack, longer and more winding, snaked across the surface, mere inches from his feet. The lake seemed alive and breathing, threatening to swallow him with every breath. He needed a different strategy. Pulling and pushing directly was not enough. Ancestral wisdom spoke of patience and observation. "The frozen river has its secrets, my son. Do not fight it. Learn from it." Borislav looked around. His eyes narrowed against the blizzard. He noticed a slight depression in the ice meters away, where snow accumulated unevenly. If he could roll the buffalo towards that depression, perhaps the slope, however small, could give him momentum. It was a risk, as it meant getting even closer to the most fragile area of the ice, but it was his only chance. With a knot in his throat, he adjusted the rope and began to work, using his own body weight as a counterbalance, moving with desperate and calculated caution. In the cabin, Anya's cough intensified, a dry, painful sound in the small dwelling. Elena, with trembling hands, tried to warm some water over the dying fire. The firewood was running out, and the cold air seemed to penetrate the hides covering the cabin. Elena's face was pale and tired, her eyes swollen from lack of sleep and anguish. She looked at Yakov, who was watching the storm through a crack in the door. "He's taking too long, Yakov." Her voice was a hoarse whisper, almost inaudible above the wind's howl. What could have happened? Yakov turned, his wrinkled face carrying the wisdom of many winters. He approached Elena, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Borislav is a pure-hearted hunter, Elena. He carries the strength of his father. But winter tests even the strongest." He offered no false hopes, but his presence was a silent comfort. The entire village felt the weight of waiting. The children, even the youngest, seemed to understand the gravity of the situation, remaining silent, their small faces serious. Hunger was not just a physical pain. It was a shadow that stretched over their souls, stealing joy and innocence. Borislav, oblivious to the village's anguish, focused all his energy on his task. He finally managed to move the buffalo a few inches towards the depression. The gigantic body rolled with a dull creak, and for an instant, Borislav thought the ice would give way completely. He felt a deep tremor beneath his feet, and the sound of a new crack, this time closer, made his heart leap. He fell to his knees, the air thin in his lungs, but he did not let go of the rope. Adrenaline coursed through his veins, mixed with fear and an iron determination. He knew he was at his limit, that every second was a gamble, but the image of Anya, the promise to his father, and the vision of Kaya reborn from hunger were the anchor that held him firm. He stood up, his knees aching, and looked at the buffalo. An immense challenge, but not impossible. Hope, however fragile, was the fuel that propelled him, a beacon in the icy darkness. Borislav, breathing heavily, felt the intense cold burn his nostrils with each inhale. He leaned over the rope, his hands numb but firm, gripping it as if it were his last lifeline. The sight of the buffalo, still imposing even in death, was a constant reminder of the magnitude of his task. The ice beneath his feet, a treacherous mirror, seemed to whisper warnings with every movement. He knew the depression was his best chance, but reaching it meant crossing the most unstable area. With a caution bordering on reverence, he began to pull and push again, using the rhythm of his own body to try and move the giant inch by inch. Every fiber of his being was on alert, his ears attentive to any sound from the ice, his eyes scanning the surface for new cracks. With each pull, a sharp pain shot through his shoulder, but Borislav ignored it, turning it into fuel for his will. He remembered his grandfather's stories, who spoke of the eagle's patience and the bear's silent strength. It wasn't just about brute force, but about persistence. The blizzard, which had once seemed an enemy, was now an ally, covering the buffalo with a layer of snow that perhaps could help slide the heavy body. He used the tip of his boot to dig small indentations in the ice, seeking traction, and pulled again, feeling the buffalo yield a fraction of an inch. It was minuscule, almost imperceptible progress, but it was a sign that the mountain could be moved. In the hide cabin, Anya's cough became more frequent and deeper, a sound that tore at Elena's heart. The girl was pale, her lips cracked and her skin feverish. Elena, with tear-filled eyes, moistened a piece of cloth in warm water and gently placed it on her daughter's forehead. "Hold on, my love," she whispered, her voice choked. "Your brother is coming. He will bring the food." But doubt was a poison spreading in her chest. Time passed, and the storm outside seemed to mock their hopes. Elder Yakov, observing the scene with his silent wisdom, felt a tightening in his chest. He knew that winter was an unforgiving judge, and that faith, however strong, was sometimes not enough. He approached Elena, his wrinkled hand touching her shoulder. Anya has her mother's strength, Elena, and Borislav, his father's courage. Do not lose hope. His words were a balm, but the worry in his eyes was undeniable. The entire village felt the weight of waiting. With each gust of wind, a shiver of fear ran through their hearts. The few remaining children, huddled near the fire, looked at the door with wide, frightened eyes, understanding the gravity of the situation without needing words. Borislav, oblivious to the village's anguish, focused on every movement, every breath. He finally managed to roll the buffalo a little further, and the gigantic body slid a few inches towards the depression. The ice groaned, a deep, prolonged sound that made the ground tremble beneath his feet. A new and alarming crack opened, this time extending for several meters and passing dangerously close to where he stood. Borislav felt his heart race, cold sweat running down his forehead. He was at his limit, every second closer to the abyss. But the image of Anya, the promise to his father, and the vision of Kaya reborn from hunger were the anchor that held him firm. A beacon of hope in the icy darkness. Borislav, his heart still pounding from the fright of the new crack, could not afford to hesitate. The ice beneath his knees seemed to vibrate, a premonition that time was running out. He felt the cold bite his bones, but adrenaline was a wild fire that propelled him. The depression, now a few meters away, was his only hope for stability. With a grunt of effort, he dug his feet in again, this time with desperate urgency. The rope, which already felt like an extension of his arms, burned his gloves. He pulled with everything he had left, leaning his body and using the buffalo's weight against itself, seeking a final push. The animal's gigantic body grated on the ice, a heavy, dragging sound that mingled with the wind's howl. Inch by inch, the buffalo slid. Borislav felt the searing pain in his right shoulder intensify, but ignored it. His eyes were fixed on the depression, and his mind on the image of Anya. "For you, my sister," he whispered, his voice hoarse and almost inaudible. He pulled once more, and with a final agonizing effort, the buffalo finally rolled into the depression. The movement made the ice groan one last time, but this time the sound was different, more contained, as if the lake had accepted the burden. Borislav fell face down on the ice, gasping for breath, his lungs burning with the frozen air. For a brief moment, he felt immense relief. The buffalo was safe, at least for now, away from the main crack. But the relief was fleeting. The blizzard continued to fall relentlessly, and the animal, even in the depression, was still a mountain of frozen meat to be moved. The task of dragging it to the safety of the village seemed as impossible as before, perhaps even more so, now that exhaustion consumed him. He needed a plan, and fast. Meanwhile, in the hide cabin, Anya's situation worsened with each passing minute. The high fever left her delirious, and her cough was incessant, a sound that echoed hopelessness in the small space. Elena, kneeling beside her daughter, held Anya's cold little hand, her own eyes red and swollen from crying. She tried to sing an old lullaby, but her voice failed, choked by pain and fear. Each gust of wind that lashed the cabin was a reminder of the relentless storm that kept her son away. Elder Yakov, observing the scene with a heavy heart, felt the fragility of life amidst the fury of Yakutia. He approached Elena, placing a gentle hand on her trembling shoulder. "Anya is strong, Elena. She has the resilience of our people. Borislav knows what he's doing. He is his father's son." But his words, though sincere, could not erase the despair that settled in everyone's hearts. The other families in the village, sheltering in their own cabins, felt the same anguish. With each passing minute, hope diminished like the campfire's flame. Borislav, oblivious to the growing anguish in the village, sat exhausted beside the buffalo. His fingers were numb and his cracked lips bled. He looked at the grey sky where the blizzard seemed endless. The promise to his father, Anya's pale face, were the only things that kept him conscious. He had completed the first part, but the greater challenge was yet to come: how to bring that mountain of meat home. Darkness was beginning to fall, and with it the temperature would plummet even further. He knew he couldn't rest. Chaya depended on him, and hope, however fragile, was still a beacon guiding him in the icy darkness. Borislav, his body exhausted and mind in a whirl, looked at the vast silhouette of the buffalo. The darkness of night enveloped the landscape, turning the world into shades of grey and white, and the cold, once merely intense, now bit with a ferocity that promised to paralyze. He knew that dragging the entire 5,000 kilograms of the animal was an impossible task for one man, especially with the unstable ice and the exhaustion weighing on every bone. A new strategy was desperately needed. His father's wisdom, always a guide, whispered in his memory. "When brute force fails, my son, the mind must find a new way. Nature offers its resources, even in scarcity." No, Borislav understood. He couldn't move the mountain, but he could dismember it. The idea of butchering the buffalo there, in the heart of the blizzard and on the treacherous ice, was terrifying. It meant hours of work under the biting cold, with exposed hands and the constant risk of the ice giving way. But it was the only way to save the meat, to bring hope to Chaya. He took out his hunting knife, a sharp and robust blade, his father's inheritance. The frozen metal burned his hand to the touch. While Borislav made his solitary decision in the hide cabin, Anya's life slowly ebbed away. The fever consumed her, and her cough, once sporadic, was now a continuous painful sound that echoed in the night's silence. Elena, her heart in pieces, held her daughter's tiny hand, trying to transmit warmth and strength. Her lips moved in silent prayers, desperate pleas to ancestral spirits to protect her son and save her girl. Tears streamed freely down her marked face, mixing with the cold sweat that beaded on her forehead. Elder Yakov, sitting near the almost extinguished fire, watched the scene with deep sorrow. He smelled hopelessness in the cabin's thin air. "The firewood is almost gone, Elena," he said, his voice low and hoarse, without taking his eyes off little Anya. "And the wind outside offers no respite." The words were a cruel reminder of reality. The village was on the brink of collapse, and with each passing minute, the flame of hope seemed to diminish. Borislav knelt beside the buffalo, feeling the ice crack slightly beneath his knees, a continuous warning of the fragility of his support. Each cut would be a battle against the cold that hardened the meat and the darkness that hindered his vision. With his hunting knife in hand, he began to work, with slow and precise movements, guided by urgency and the memory of his father's lessons on how to honor the animal and utilize every part. The wind howled, lashing snowflakes into his face, and the sound of the blade cutting through flesh was the only noise besides the storm, a somber melody of survival. Suddenly, a deafening deep crack echoed beneath him, much stronger than any other sound the ice had ever produced. The ground trembled violently. The ice beneath the buffalo gave way dramatically, and the enormous mass of the animal began to sink slowly, dragging Borislav with it, who was kneeling dangerously close to its side. The dark, icy lake water, which he so feared, bubbled up and appeared in the cracks that opened in a spiderweb pattern around the prey, like rapidly spreading dark blue veins. Borislav's heart leapt into his throat, a frantic drum in his chest. He had no time to think, only to react instinctively. If the buffalo sank completely, everything would be lost. The meat, the hope, the lives of Anya and the village would be swallowed forever by the icy abyss. With a desperate cry that was lost in the wind's howl, he clung to the rope that was still firmly attached to the animal's leg, using it as an improvised anchor against the force of the fall. He needed to prevent the buffalo from being dragged into the depths. He needed to save it from the icy water that threatened to swallow it, and with it the future of Kair. With a desperate cry that was lost in the wind's howl, he clung to the rope that was still firmly attached to the animal's leg, using it as an improvised anchor against the force of the fall. He needed to prevent the buffalo from being dragged into the depths. He needed to save it from the icy water that threatened to swallow it, and with it, the future of Kair. The dark, icy water rose rapidly, engulfing Borislav's boots and biting his ankles with searing pain. The shock of the cold was excruciating, stealing his breath. He felt the ice floor beneath him waver even more, the cracks expanding with a terrifying sound of snapping and groaning. The buffalo, with its colossal weight, continued to sink, dragging him down. Borislav pulled the rope with all his might, the muscles in his arms and shoulders screaming in protest. The rope cut through his gloves, and he felt the skin of his hands burn under the friction. His feet tried to find purchase on the edges of the ice that still resisted, but the surface was slippery and treacherous. The image of Anya, pale and fragile, flashed in his mind, a beacon of desperation and determination. He could not fail. Not now. He could not allow winter to swallow his sister, his village. With superhuman effort, Borislav managed to turn his body, using his own weight as a counterbalance against the buffalo's sinking. He dug his feet into the more solid edge of the ice, which seemed like a precarious island amidst the catastrophe. The rope stretched to its maximum, vibrating with tension, and for an instant, the buffalo stopped sinking. Its head and part of its back were still visible above the water, but the rest of its body was immersed in the icy abyss. The relief was brief, as the ice continued to break around him, and the dark water licked the edges, threatening to swallow him at any moment. While Borislav fought against the fury of the lake in the hide cabin, Anya's breathing became shallow and irregular. Elena, her face bathed in tears, pressed her daughter against her chest, trying to infuse her with some of her own warmth. Her lips moved in whispered prayers, her eyes fixed on the door, as if she could conjure Borislav's presence. Elder Yakov, with a look of deep sadness, lit the last animal fat torch, which cast a faint, flickering light on the scene. "Hope is a fragile flame this winter, Elena," Yakov said, his voice choked with emotion. "But Borislav is the fire that keeps it burning." The other women of the village, who gathered silently in the cabin, shared Elena's anguish. Their faces, once marked by hunger, now reflected an even greater despair. They looked at Anya, at Elena, and then at the door, where the storm howled like a hungry wolf. Each gust of wind seemed to bring with it news of disaster. Back on the lake, Borislav knew he couldn't stay there. The ice was giving way rapidly, and the cold water was already numbing his legs. He needed to get the buffalo out of the water, or at least most of it, before the meat froze and became useless. With a new surge of adrenaline, he began to pull the rope again, this time with a different strategy. He used his own body as a pivot, swinging and pulling, trying to leverage the animal's inertia. Inch by inch, the buffalo began to move, slowly sliding out of the water, with a terrifying sucking sound. With each advance, Borislav felt the exhaustion deepen, but the sight of the meat emerging from the abyss was a balm for his soul. He was saving Kair, 1 inch at a time. Borislav, his body tense and muscles trembling, continued to pull the rope, feeling the colossal weight of the buffalo slowly yield. Each inch was an arduous victory, one with the strength of his will and Anya's image in his mind. The dark water, which had once licked his legs, now receded, revealing the animal's thick, frozen hide. The sucking sound, once terrifying, transformed into a hymn of progress, a sign that the icy abyss was being conquered. He dug his feet into the edge of the ice, which seemed firmer now that the buffalo's weight was being distributed differently. With a hoarse cry of effort, he gave one last powerful pull, and the gigantic body of the buffalo slid completely out of the water, stopping in the depression, but still dangerously close to the cracked edge. Borislav fell to his knees again, gasping, his chest rising and falling rapidly. The frozen air burned his throat, and his lungs felt like they were on fire. He looked at the buffalo, now safe from the water, but still an insurmountable mountain. The relief was immense, but exhaustion hit him like an avalanche. His hands were numb, and his fingers, even inside his gloves, felt like pieces of ice. The task of dragging it whole to the village was, as he had already realized, impossible. He needed to start dismembering it right there, under the relentless blizzard and the growing darkness. The idea of exposing his hands to the biting cold to cut the frozen meat was terrible, but there was no other choice. Kaya's life depended on it, and he felt the weight of every soul in the village on his tired shoulders. In the hide cabin, Anya's breathing became even weaker and shallower. Elena, her face pale and eyes tear-filled, felt her heart clench with each of her daughter's breaths. The girl was almost unconscious, her small lips blue and skin feverish. Elena tried to warm her with her own hands, rubbing her arms and legs, but the cold seemed to have settled inside her, stealing the little vitality she had left. "Please, Borislav," Elena whispered, her voice choked. "Come back to us." Elder Yakov, observing the scene with a look of deep sadness, slowly shook his head. He approached the fire, which was now just dying embers, and tried to rekindle it with a piece of birch bark. "The flame of life is strong, Elena," he said, his voice hoarse, "but it needs fuel." His words echoed the cruel reality the village faced, a cold truth that spread through every corner of the cabin. The other women, sitting in silence, shared the same despair, their faces marked by hunger and anxiety. Their eyes met, full of mutual pain, a silent understanding of the tragedy unfolding. Hope, once a small glimmer, now seemed like a distant star, almost invisible in the deepening darkness. Borislav, hunting knife in hand, felt the icy metal burn his skin through the thin gloves he wore for greater dexterity. He knew he would need more than just brute force. He would need all his wisdom and patience, his father's wisdom. The lessons on how to honor the animal and utilize every part echoed in his mind like a mantra. He began to work, his movements slow and deliberate, each cut a battle against the flesh, hardened by the extreme cold. The wind howled, lashing snowflakes into his face, and the darkness of night enveloped him, making the task even more difficult and dangerous. He needed to be quick but precise, for every piece of meat was precious, a promise of life for his village. The smell of blood, which usually invigorated him, now seemed to mix with the smell of despair and ice. He thought of Anya, of his father, of the solemn promise that sustained him. This was what kept him on his feet, what drove him to continue, even when his fingers were numb. His muscles screamed in protest, and his body longed for rest. He could not stop. Kaya depended on him. With each cut, he felt the pain in his hands and shoulders, but he ignored it, transforming it into fuel for his unwavering will. He was saving his village, one piece at a time, under the relentless fury of the Yakutian winter. The sharp blade struggled against the thick hide and frozen flesh, demanding a strength he barely possessed. Every movement was slow, exhausting, and the cold penetrated his gloves, numbing his fingers to the bone. He felt the uncontrollable tremor in his hands, not just from the cold, but from the exhaustion that consumed him. The relentless blizzard quickly covered the exposed parts of the buffalo, threatening to freeze the meat before he could separate it. Borislav needed to act urgently, but haste could lead to a fatal error on the treacherous ice. He imagined Anya's face, her blue lips, and the image propelled him to continue, to find a reserve of strength he didn't know he possessed. He knew he couldn't take the entire animal, even in large pieces. He would need smaller, more manageable portions that could be transported on his improvised sled. With each cut, he visualized the meat being cooked, the warm smell filling the cabins, life returning to the eyes of his sister and the entire village. While Borislav fought against the frozen giant, in the hide cabin, Anya's breathing became almost inaudible. Elena, her face disfigured by pain, felt her heart break with each weak breath from her daughter. She hugged her with all her strength, trying to transfer her own warmth, her own life, to little Anya. Tears streamed incessantly, wetting the girl's fine hair. "My love, don't leave me," Elena whispered, her voice a heart-wrenching lament. "Your brother is coming. He will save us." But Elena's faith was fading, like the dying flame in the center of the cabin. Elder Yakov, seeing Elena's anguish, felt his own soul heavy. He knelt beside them, his wrinkled hand caressing Anya's feverish forehead. "Anya is a warrior, Elena. She has the strength of our land," he said, his voice choked. "Borislav is the hope that guides us. He will not fail." His words were a fragile comfort, almost a whisper against the wind's howl that seemed to mock their hopes. The other women, huddled in the corners, watched the scene with tear-filled eyes, their own hungry children in their arms. The entire village hung by a thread, and time, which once seemed infinite, now raced against them, relentless and cruel. With each passing minute, the darkness of winter seemed to deepen, swallowing the little light that remained. With each passing minute, the darkness of winter seemed to deepen, swallowing the little light that remained. In the hide cabin, Anya's breathing became an almost invisible thread, a fragile whisper that barely moved her small chest. Elena, her eyes fixed on her daughter, felt despair tighten her heart like an icy knot. Tears no longer flowed, they had dried, leaving a salty, rough trail on her pale face. She squeezed Anya's cold little hand, trying, with all her soul, to transfer the warmth she felt draining from her own body. "Anya, my love," she murmured, her voice hoarse and almost inaudible. "Don't give up. Your brother is coming. He is strong, like his father." But each word seemed to echo into the void, finding no response from the inert girl. Elder Yakov, observing the scene with the heavy wisdom of his many winters, felt the fragility of life in Kair. He approached the fire, which was now just a handful of dying embers, and tried in vain to rekindle it with a dry branch. Heat was scarce, and the night's cold penetrated the cabin's hides, adding another layer of anguish. "Winter is a test, Elena," Yakov said, his voice low and full of sorrow. "But our people are made of rock and ice. Borislav has the strength of his ancestors." His words were a fragile balm, but the truth of cold and hunger was stronger than any comfort. The other women, huddled in their corners, with their own hungry children, exchanged glances of mutual pain, their hopes fading with the fire's flame. Far away on the frozen lake, Borislav continued his solitary battle. The knife blade, once sharp, now seemed dull against the buffalo's flesh, which the extreme cold had turned to stone. Each cut demanded brutal force, an effort that made his muscles scream and his bones ache. He felt the uncontrollable tremor in his hands, not just from the cold that penetrated his thin gloves, but from the exhaustion that consumed him. The relentless blizzard quickly covered the exposed parts of the animal, threatening to freeze the meat before he could separate it into smaller, manageable portions. He needed to be quick, but haste could lead him to a fatal error on the treacherous ice which still groaned and cracked under the buffalo's colossal weight. The image of Anya, her blue lips and pale face, was the only thing that propelled him, an inner flame that refused to extinguish. He visualized the meat being cooked, the warm smell filling the cabins, life returning to the eyes of his sister and the entire village. With a new surge of adrenaline, he plunged the knife with more determination, feeling the searing pain in his shoulders. He needed more than strength. He needed cunning. Remembering his father's lessons about the weak points of large animals, even after death, Borislav changed his approach. Instead of direct cuts, he began to look for the joints, the natural junctures the buffalo's body offered. It was slower, more delicate work, but potentially more effective. He felt the knife's metal find a point of less resistance, and with a grunt of effort, the blade finally plunged deeper, separating a portion of the meat with a dry, satisfying sound. The relief, however brief, was a balm for his exhausted soul. He was making progress, one piece at a time, under the relentless fury of the Yakutian winter. Hope, however fragile, still pulsed in his chest, a distant echo of the life he fought to preserve. Hope, however fragile, still pulsed in his chest, a distant echo of the life he fought to preserve. With the first portion of meat separated, Borislav felt a mix of relief and despair. What he had achieved was only a fraction of what was needed. The sight of the colossal buffalo, still a mountain of frozen meat under the blizzard, was overwhelming. His fingers, already numb, could barely hold the knife. Every muscle in his body screamed in protest, but the image of Anya, pale and fragile, was a relentless whip that propelled him. He knew he couldn't take everything. The improvised sled, already heavy with hides and tools, would barely support more than the vital parts. He needed to be selective, prioritizing the liver, heart, and fattier cuts, those that offered the quickest and most vital energy for his hungry village. With renewed determination, he bent down again, seeking the joints with the precision his father had taught him. The blade met resistance, but he forced it, feeling the snap of tendons and the separation of flesh with a guttural sound that was lost in the wind's howl. Another piece, then another, each an arduous triumph against the cold and exhaustion. He piled the portions onto a tarp, the dark, almost frozen blood staining the white snow. In the hide cabin, Anya's breathing became so shallow that Elena could barely feel it. The girl's face was livid, and her lips, once blue, now appeared almost purple. Elena pressed her against her chest, her eyes wide, searching for any sign of life. Tears had dried, replaced by a terrifying emptiness in her chest. "Anya, my angel," Elena whispered, her voice broken in a silent lament. "Don't leave us. Your brother is coming. He promised." But the promise seemed a distant memory, almost an echo of a warmer, more hopeful time. Elder Yakov, sitting beside the dying embers, felt the cold of despair settle in his soul. He tried to rekindle the fire one last time, but the wood was damp and the heat non-existent. "Borislav's strength is our strength," Yakov said, his voice hoarse, more to himself than to Elena. "He will find the way." The other women, with their own children huddled in their arms, watched the scene with silent pain, their faces marked by hunger and fear. The flame of hope in Kaya was extinguishing, and the air in the cabin seemed denser, heavier, foreshadowing the end. Far away, Borislav had managed to separate 3 large portions of meat, the noblest and most essential cuts. The sled, now loaded, sank into the soft snow, and the effort to move it would be immense. The cold was excruciating, penetrating his clothes and numbing his limbs. He knew he couldn't delay any longer. Every minute was an eternity for Anya. As he tied the last hides over the meat, a deep, prolonged groan echoed beneath his feet. The lake ice, already weakened, cracked with renewed force, and a new network of fissures spread rapidly. This time directly under the sled. The ground trembled, and the sled with its newly acquired weight sank slightly. Borislav's heart pounded. He had underestimated the fragility of the ice, even far from where the buffalo had fallen. The blizzard intensified, lashing his face with fury and further obscuring his vision. He needed to get out of there, and fast. In the cabin, a small, almost imperceptible sigh escaped Anya's lips. Elena, her face pressed against her daughter's, felt it. The sigh was followed by absolute silence, an emptiness that chilled her blood. "Anya," Elena whispered, her voice choked with terror, gently shaking the girl. Her eyes sought Yakov's, who was already approaching, his face contorted in a mask of pain. The elder touched Anya's pulse, and his gaze darkened. At that exact moment, Borislav, kilometers away, felt an icy shiver run down his spine, a dark premonition that struck him like a blow. He looked at the dark sky, at the blizzard's fury, and at the treacherous ice beneath his feet. The village needed him. Anya needed him. With a hoarse cry that was lost in the wind, he grabbed the sled rope, dug his feet into the ice, and pulled with the strength of a man, fighting not only for his life, but for the lives of all he loved, against a winter that seemed determined to swallow them forever. Borislav, with a hoarse cry that was lost in the wind, grabbed the sled rope, dug his feet into the ice, and pulled with the strength of a man fighting not only for his life, but for the lives of all he loved, against a winter that seemed determined to swallow them forever. The ice beneath his feet groaned again, a deep and menacing lament that made his heart race. Cracks spread like spider webs, thin and treacherous, but he could not stop. The icy premonition from the cabin of Anya's breath was a fire that burned in his chest, stronger than the cold. He pulled, his muscles screaming in protest, the heavy sled sinking into the snow and dragging across the unstable ice. Each step was a gamble, each pull a silent prayer. He knew the way back was long and dangerous, but the image of Anya, her blue lips, was the only compass guiding him. In the hide cabin, the silence that followed Anya's last breath was more deafening than any wind's howl. Elena, her face pressed against her daughter's, felt the emptiness, the cold emanating from that small body. Her eyes, once filled with tears, were now dry and wide, reflecting a paralyzing terror. She couldn't speak, only pressed the girl against her, rocking her gently, as if she could wake her from a deep, icy sleep. Yakov, the elder, knelt beside them, his wrinkled hand touching Anya's pulse. His eyes, which had seen so many winters and so many losses, closed for an instant, and a heavy sigh escaped his lips. He slowly shook his head, and that simple action was a sentence, a blow that struck Elena with the force of lightning. A guttural lament, coming from the depths of her soul, tore through the cabin's silence. The other women, who watched with their own children huddled in their arms, lowered their eyes, their hopes crushed, their own hearts heavy with mutual pain. The light of the last animal-fat torch which Yakov had lit seemed to diminish, as if the very flame of life in Kaya was extinguishing. But then a sound, distant, almost imperceptible over the wind's howl, a creak of wood and the dragging of something heavy. Yakov raised his head, his eyes fixed on the cabin door. Elena, still embracing Anya, did not hear. She was lost in her own abyss of pain. The sound repeated, stronger, closer. The other women also heard, and their eyes, once empty, began to show a flicker of questioning, of an almost forbidden hope. Yakov stood up, his movements slow but filled with a new urgency. He walked to the door, his heart pounding in his chest, and pulled back the heavy hide that served as the entrance. Outside, under the fury of the blizzard, a silhouette slowly materialized. A man, bent under the weight of an improvised sled, dragging a dark mountain of meat. It was Borislav. His face was covered in ice and snow, his eyes red from exhaustion, but a glimmer of determination still burned in them. He staggered, almost falling, but remained standing, pulling the sled to the cabin entrance. The smell of fresh meat, even frozen, filled the air, an aroma the village hadn't smelled in weeks, a smell of life. Elena, seeing her brother's figure, raised her head. Her eyes met his, and a wave of shock and relief hit her. She let go of Anya for an instant, and the girl, as if sensing her brother's presence, let out a faint but perceptible sigh. It was not the sigh from before, but a breath of life, a tenuous thread that refused to break. Yakov, with a faint but tearful smile, helped Borislav drag the meat inside. The other women, with muffled cries of joy and disbelief, rushed to help, their fingers trembling as they touched the icy meat. Borislav fell to his knees, exhausted, but his eyes were fixed on Anya. Elena, her voice choked with emotion, took a small piece of liver, still warm from the buffalo's body heat, and Yakov, with steady hands, crushed it and mixed it with a little melted snow. With a wooden spoon, he gently brought the mixture to Anya's lips. The girl, with an almost imperceptible effort, swallowed. And then, to everyone's surprise and joy, her small eyes opened, weak but present. A murmur of gratitude and hope filled the cabin. Kair was saved. Borislav had fulfilled his promise. Winter was still long, but the flame of life had been rekindled. The flame of life, an almost extinguished ember, now crackled with renewed vigor inside the hide cabin. Anya's small sigh, followed by the opening of her eyes, was the miracle that tore through the veil of despair. Elena, with warm tears streaming, hugged her daughter tightly, feeling the faint warmth return. She kissed Anya's forehead repeatedly, a murmur of gratitude escaping. "My angel, you're back," she whispered, her voice choked. Borislav, kneeling on the icy ground, felt exhaustion crush him. But his eyes did not leave Anya. Seeing her swallow the mixture, open her eyes, was the deepest reward for every aching muscle, every minute of excruciating cold. Yakov approached, placing a heavy hand on his shoulder. "You succeeded, my son," the elder said, his voice hoarse. "You brought life back to Kair." Borislav merely nodded, unable to speak, but a faint smile of exhaustion and relief lit up his ice-covered face. The other women, once paralyzed by fear, now moved with feverish energy. The buffalo meat, even frozen, was a glorious sight. They began to cut it into smaller pieces, their hands trembling with haste and hope. The fire, once dying, was fed, and soon an iron cauldron heated over the flames, exhaling steam that promised nourishment and warmth. The smell of cooking meat, a forgotten aroma, filled the cabin, warming the air and hungry hearts. Elena, after ensuring Anya was more stable, turned to Borislav. She knelt, and with trembling hands removed the ice from his hair and beard. Her eyes, filled with immeasurable gratitude, met his. "You are your father's strength," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "You saved us all." Borislav felt a knot in his throat. His mother's approval, the glimmer of hope, was everything. He took her hand, squeezing it gently, a silent promise to continue fighting. As the hours passed, the meat was distributed. Small portions were given first to the children, then to the elders, and only then to the adults. Each bite was savored, a victory against hunger. Anya, though still weak, accepted a few more spoonfuls of the nutritious soup, and a little color returned to her pale cheeks. She looked at Borislav, and a tiny, almost imperceptible smile formed on her lips. It was a smile of recognition, of security, of love. Yakov, observing the scene, felt a warmth spread through his chest that the harshest winter could not extinguish. "This is the spirit of Kair," he proclaimed, his voice now stronger, resonating through the cabin. "Unity, courage, sacrifice. Borislav reminded us who we are. Winter will still challenge us, but it will not break us. Together as a family, we will face what comes." His words were a reminder of the continuous battle, but Borislav's victory had ignited a new flame of resilience. Night advanced, the winds howl less threatening. Children, bellies full, fell asleep in their mother's arms, faces serene. Borislav, exhausted, rested, his eyes closing. His oath fulfilled, Kair was reborn. Hope, like the sun that would one day return, had come back, stronger and brighter. The village, united by the love and courage of the young hunter, ready for the long winter, knew that life resilient, would always find a way. The following morning brought pale light and biting cold, but in the main cabin, the air was imbued with the warmth of rekindled hope. Borislav, after a deep and well-deserved sleep, awoke with aching muscles, but the weight in his heart had been replaced by an intoxicating lightness. His eyes found Anya, who slept peacefully beside Elena, a soft pink returning to her cheeks. The small smile on Borislav's lips was one of pure gratitude. Elena, sitting near the fire, watched her daughter with a serenity long lost. The empty bowl of meat soup was silent testimony to the turning point. She turned to Borislav, her eyes tear-filled. "You brought more than food, my son," she whispered, her voice choked. "You brought faith back." Borislav merely squeezed her hand. Elder Yakov supervised the distribution of the remaining meat. Each portion was treated with reverence. The women worked together, cutting, cooking, and storing the meat in snow pits, protected by hides, for the days to come. Laughter, once forgotten, timidly echoed among the cabins. The children, with full bellies and joyful faces, played near the fire, breaking the winter's silence. Borislav, though exhausted, felt a new responsibility. His oath to his father was not just about one hunt, but about the continuous protection of Kaya. He knew that winter held many challenges. The buffalo meat, though abundant, would not last forever. They would need more or to ration wisely, but now they had time to plan and strengthen themselves. He joined Yakov, who looked at him with silent pride. "Your father would be proud, Borislav," the elder said, his voice grave. "You not only hunted a giant, you rekindled the spirit of our people. Resilience is keeping the flame alive in your heart, even when all seems lost." Borislav listened, absorbing every word, feeling the weight of ancestral wisdom. In the following days, Kaya transformed. The sharing of meat was not just a necessity, but a ritual that united everyone. Meals became moments of communion, of stories and plans for the future. Borislav, with other hunters, organized smaller expeditions to hunt hares and foxes, supplementing the diet and teaching tracking and survival techniques. He became a leader, inspiring everyone. Anya slowly regained her strength. Her eyes, once dull, now followed Borislav with silent admiration. The bond between brother and sister, forged on the edge of the abyss, was stronger than ever. Elena, her soul at peace, dedicated herself to caring for her daughter and supporting her son, knowing that a united family was the true fortress against the relentless winter. Winter was still long, with blizzards and freezing temperatures, but Kaya was no longer a village on the brink of annihilation. It was a beacon of resilience, a testament to the power of love, courage, and human connection. Every member, from Yakov to Anya, carried Borislav's story in their hearts, a reminder that, even in the most brutal conditions, hope, once ignited, would never extinguish. Life, in icy Yakutia, would always find a way, guided by the unbreakable strength of its people.